Your thighs shake when you sit down slowly. A 10-second descent into a chair, a movement you perform dozens of times daily without effort at normal speed, and the quadriceps tremble as if the load were 10 times what it is. The shaking is not weakness, it is 69 billion cerebellar neurons revealing that they have been coasting on stored motor programs for decades and cannot compute the movement in real time. The brain that sits you down in 1 second is playing back a recording, a pre-computed trajectory. It is executed thousands of times, deployed without conscious participation. The brain that sits you down in 10 is computing live. The stored program cannot execute because the speed it was calibrated for is absent. The timing is wrong. The force profiles are wrong. The momentum the program relied on is gone. The cerebellum must calculate the motor output for every degree of the descent as it happens. Adjusting quadriceps tension continuously, recalculating ankle position at each moment, monitoring your center of mass through a trajectory it has no stored solution for. The shaking is the computation made visible, and what the computation reveals, the computation trains. Cerebellum contains roughly half the brain's total neurons, packed into a structure the size of a fist at the base of your skull. Its primary function is motor coordination, taking a movement intention from the motor cortex and converting it into smooth, accurate, precisely timed execution. For movements performed thousands of times, walking, reaching, sitting, climbing, the cerebellum stores motor programs. Pre-computed trajectories, the muscle activation sequences, the timing, the force profiles, all calculated from prior experience and stored for rapid deployment. When the motor cortex sends the intention, the cerebellum retrieves the program and executes it. The computation was done during learning. The execution is playback. These stored programs have a speed window. They were calibrated at the speed the movement is typically performed. A chair sit program was built at 1 second speed. A walking program was built at your habitual pace. A reaching program was built at the speed your arm normally extends. Outside the calibrated range, significantly slower, the program cannot execute because the timing, the force profiles, and the momentum assumptions no longer apply. The window is narrow. A 20% speed reduction may still fall within the program's tolerance. A 50% reduction exceeds it. A 90% reduction, the 10-second chair descent, is so far outside the window that the program is useless, and the cerebellum must generate every millisecond of motor output from scratch. Speed-accuracy trade-off. Fitz's law, one of the oldest established principles in motor neuroscience, states that movement accuracy increases as movement speed decreases. The relationship is logarithmic, not linear. Having the speed more than doubles the precision of the endpoint. Every physical therapist knows this intuitively. They slow patients' movements to improve control. What the intuition misses is why the improvement has nothing to do with patience or caution. It is a fundamental shift in how the cerebellum processes the movement. Below what motor neuroscientists call the automation threshold, the cerebellum switches from retrieval to computation, as Manto and colleagues described in Cerebellum, mapping the transition from stored program execution to real-time cerebellar processing. 69 billion neurons shift from memory retrieval to live processing. The brain's metabolic demand increases, the movement feels harder, and the control becomes less smooth, and the shaking begins. Tremor itself is diagnostic. Where in the range the shaking begins tells you where the cerebellar program degrades. If the tremor starts at the bottom of the descent, the deepest flexion, the stored program loses accuracy in end-range positions where the joint angles are most extreme. If the tremor appears through the mid-range, the program has degraded more broadly. If the tremor is absent entirely during a 10-second descent, the cerebellar computation is intact at that speed. Slow further until the tremor appears, because the tremor marks the exact boundary between stored program territory and real-time computation territory. That boundary is where the training happens. Every movement you perform at habitual speed is cerebellar playback. Your brain is coasting on stored programs built years ago, programs that degrade with age as synaptic efficiency decreases and timing accuracy drifts. But you never notice the degradation because the programs are never tested outside their speed window. The movement still works at habitual speed. The degradation is invisible until you slow the movement to half speed and the wobble appears instantly. The slow movement revealed a deficit that was already there. Well, The proprioceptive system, because what slow speed does to sensory resolution, explains why the cerebellar map built from slow data is qualitatively different from the map built from fast data. Proprioceptors fire in response to changes in muscle length, joint angle, and tendon tension. As Proska and Gandavia documented in Physiological Reviews, establishing the receptor physiology that governs how the brain maps body position. During fast movement, the body passes through each position in milliseconds. The proprioceptive signal for any given joint angle is brief, a spike of data that the cerebellum must process before the next spike arrives. High-frequency sampling but low resolution per sample. Your brain registers that the arm moved but has limited data about each position along the way. During slow movement, the body dwells at each position for longer. The proprioceptive signal for each joint angle is sustained. The receptors fire continuously while the joint holds that angle. The cerebellum receives extended data for each position. Lower frequency sampling but dramatically higher resolution per sample, and it is the resolution, not the frequency, that determines how detailed the cerebellar map becomes. The brain builds a comprehensive map of every degree of the trajectory rather than a blurred summary of the whole arc. The map from a single slow repetition contains more positional data than the map from 10 fast repetitions combined. Proprioceptive sharpening, the stairs discussion described during descent, where narrowed error tolerance forced spatial judgment to improve, operates here through a different mechanism. Stairs sharpen proprioception by demanding accuracy. Slow movement sharpens proprioception by extending the sampling window at each joint angle, giving the cerebellum more data per position than fast movement can provide, regardless of how accurate the fast movement is. Difference matters because the proprioceptive map the cerebellum builds from slow movement data is qualitatively different from the map it builds from fast movement data, and the quality of that map determines the quality of every motor correction the cerebellum computes. A detailed map allows precise corrections. A blurred map forces approximate ones. The distinction between precise and approximate is the distinction between recovering from a stumble and hitting the ground. The fall recovery correction is where map resolution matters most. When you slip on wet tile or miss a step, the cerebellum has roughly 80 to 120 milliseconds to compute a corrective motor output. The accuracy of that computation depends on the resolution of the proprioceptive map the cerebellum is working from. A map built from fast movement data, low resolution, blurred positions, gaps between samples, produces an approximate correction. A map built from slow movement data, high resolution, detailed positions, continuous coverage, produces a precise one. The approximate correction may catch the fall. The precise correction does catch the fall. The precise correction does catch the fall. The difference between the two maps is the difference between an ankle that corrects a stumble with a rapid lateral shift to the exact position required and an ankle that attempts the correction a fraction of a degree off target, converting a recoverable stumble into a lateral fall. Proprioceptive map resolution determines correction precision determines outcome, and map resolution is built exclusively during slow movement, where the sampling window at each joint angle is long enough for the cerebellum to encode the position in detail, rather than register it as a blur between two other positions. Now, the muscle physics, because what slow speed does to fiber recruitment overturns what most people assume about how muscles get stronger. Slow movement requires sustained force production through the entire range. Motor units cannot fire in a single burst because the movement takes 10 times longer. They must cycle, some fibers contracting while others rest, then switching. This rotation recruits a broader population of fibers over the duration than a single fast contraction does. If your thighs burn during a 10-second descent, a burning sensation absent from the 1-second version of the identical movement, you are feeling motor units cycling through a sustained contraction they have not performed in years. The burning is the maintenance signal arriving at fibers, the fast version skipped. Fibers that a fast movement never activates, the smaller, slower to recruit motor units that sit below the fast twitch recruitment threshold, engage because the sustained demand reaches them. Motor unit rotation also explains why slow movement produces muscle soreness in positions that fast movement does not. Fibers that never participated in the fast version of the movement are being recruited for the first time in the slow version. The soreness is the adaptation signal arriving at tissue that the habitual speed movement left untouched for years. If you perform a single 10-second chair descent and feel quadriceps soreness the next day, you have identified muscle fibers that decades of normal speed sitting failed to recruit. Fibers that have been present, functional, and completely unloaded because the fast movement never needed them. Mechanotransduction signal, the mechanical input that triggers muscle maintenance, scales with duration. A 1-second chair descent places the quadriceps under tension for 1 second. A 10-second descent places them under tension for 10. The maintenance signal is 10 times longer from the same movement performed at 1/10 the speed. The muscle receives a stimulus at slow speed that fast speed cannot deliver because the tension window is too brief to trigger the signaling cascade. You now know what slow speed does to the cerebellum, the proprioceptive system, and the muscle fibers. The question changes. From the physics inside the body to the population scale evidence of what that physics produces when applied systematically to fall prevention. Cochrane's systematic reviews on fall prevention, spanning dozens of randomized controlled trials across populations and continents, show a finding that exercise physiologists struggle to explain for years. Slow movement practices, primarily Tai Chi, reduce fall rates in adults over 65 by 40 to 60%, as Sherrington and colleagues compiled in the Cochrane database of systematic reviews. Conventional strength training reduces falls by 15 to 25%. Balance training on unstable surfaces reduces falls by 20 to 30%. Tai Chi outperforms both. Consistently, across studies, across decades of data. Mechanism is something other than strength. Tai Chi produces less muscle force than resistance training, and something other than balance challenge. Tai Chi produces less perturbation than wobble boards. The mechanism is what makes Tai Chi unique among all movement forms, sustained slow movement through continuously changing positions. Every second of a Tai Chi sequence, the body's center of mass shifts, forward, backward, laterally, rotationally. The speed is slow enough that momentum provides zero assistance. The cerebellum computes the balance solution for each position in real time. The proprioceptive system samples at maximum resolution. The motor cortex generates novel control outputs because the positions are unfamiliar and the stored programs cannot help. Vestibular contribution amplifies during slow movement through a mechanism fast movement suppresses. The vestibular system in the inner ear detects head position and acceleration, but during fast movement, the vestibular signal is partially overridden by visual and proprioceptive inputs that arrive faster and update more frequently. The balance hierarchy, the barefoot discussion described, plantar fastest, vestibular secondary, visual slowest, shifts during slow movement as sensory update rates change and the vestibular channel's relative contribution increases. The cerebellum integrates all three, visual, proprioceptive, vestibular, and during slow movement, the weighting shifts toward the vestibular channel. Slow movement trains the vestibular cerebellar integration that fast movement partially bypasses. The implications compound with age. Vestibular hair cells in the semicircular canals thin, and the otolith organs lose sensitivity after 50. A vestibular system receiving less practice through fast movement suppression and declining in hardware sensitivity is doubly compromised, degrading from disuse and aging simultaneously. Slow movement addresses the disuse by restoring the vestibular channel to primary weighting in the cerebellar balance computation. The hardware decline cannot be reversed. The integration weighting can, and the integration is what determines whether the vestibular signal reaches the cerebellum with enough influence to drive a correction when the room is dark, the floor is wet, or the visual environment provides no useful reference. The fall in the unlit hallway, navigating a familiar space in darkness, is a vestibular event. The eyes contribute nothing. The proprioceptors contribute baseline data. The vestibular system is the primary balance channel in darkness, and slow movement is the only common practice that trains the cerebellar weighting the channel requires to function as the sole input. If you have ever watched someone practice Tai Chi in a park, the impossibly slow weight shifts, the controlled single-leg transitions, the arms tracing arcs through positions no daily movement visits. You were watching a cerebellar training session disguised as meditation. And then, the critical distinction. Strength training loads muscles in familiar positions. The cerebellum retrieves stored programs for the squat, the lunge, the press. Balance boards create instability in a fixed position. The cerebellum learns one solution and stores it. Tai Chi creates continuously moving instability that never repeats the same position twice. The cerebellum cannot encode a program from a sequence that never repeats. Continuous novelty is the mechanism. A slow squat, even at 10 seconds, is a single trajectory the cerebellum will eventually learn and store. Tai Chi prevents storage by continuously varying the trajectory, the direction, the weight distribution, and the rotational demand. The cerebellum is perpetually computing because the input never repeats. If you do not practice Tai Chi, the principle applies to any slow movement performed with deliberate variation, changing the foot width of a slow squat, altering the arm position during a slow stand, varying the direction of a slow turn. Variation prevents automation. Automation is what slow movement training exists to overcome. Falls do not happen in familiar positions. They happen on wet tile, uneven curbs, unexpected steps, novel positions the cerebellum has no stored program for. The practice that prepares the cerebellum for novel positions is the practice that presents continuously novel balance demands at a speed slow enough for real-time computation and learning. The Cochrane data becomes more striking when you examine what the falls that did occur look like. Among Tai Chi practitioners who fell, injury severity was lower. The falls produced fewer fractures, fewer hospitalizations, and fewer transitions to assisted living than falls among non-practitioners. The cerebellar computation that Tai Chi trained did not prevent every fall, but it converted catastrophic falls into recoverable ones by providing the real-time correction that slowed the descent, redirected the impact, or triggered a protective response the untrained cerebellum could not compute quickly enough. The body that practiced slow movement fell better when it fell at all. The difference between a hip fracture and a bruised knee is often the quality of the corrective computation in the 80 milliseconds after balance is lost. 80 milliseconds that no strength training program can address because strength is not the bottleneck. Computation speed is. Fall incidents dropped by 55% in community-dwelling older adults who practice Tai Chi, as Lee and colleagues demonstrated in the Journal of the American Geriatric Society, a reduction no strength training program matched. My chair descent takes 10 seconds now, a practice that began as an experiment and converted into a daily neurological calibration the morning the shaking stopped and the smoothness arrived. The wobble that revealed the cerebellar deficit on day 1 was gone by week 3. Because the cerebellum rebuilt the real-time computation pathway the stored program had been concealing. Well, the breathing integration, because what slow speed does to the diaphragm reveals a disconnection that decades of fast movement produced. Slow movement forces a coupling between breathing and movement that habitual speed movement never demands. When the body moves slowly through a demanding position, a slow descent, a slow weight shift, a slow rotation, the diaphragm must simultaneously maintain intra-abdominal pressure for spinal stability and continue respiratory gas exchange. The dual demand at slow speed, where the stabilization requirement is sustained rather than momentary, forces the diaphragm into a coordination pattern fast movement never asks for. Coordination is measurable. Slow controlled movement produces a breathing pattern that synchronizes exhalation with the highest load phase and inhalation with the recovery phase. This synchronization optimizes both stabilization pressure and respiratory efficiency simultaneously. The diaphragm learns to serve two functions at once, a capacity it possessed but has not exercised since the last time sustained slow movement was part of daily life. If you feel breathless during a slow controlled descent, if you can walk briskly for 30 minutes without respiratory distress but cannot perform a 10-second squat without holding your breath, the respiratory system and the motor system have been running independently for decades. Slow movement reconnects them. The reconnection is immediate. From the first slow repetition, the breathing pattern begins adapting. By the second week, the exhalation synchronizes with the load phase automatically rather than through conscious effort. By the third week, the breath hold reflex during slow descent diminishes as the diaphragm develops the coordination to stabilize and ventilate simultaneously. The capacity was never lost. It was dormant, waiting for a movement slow enough to demand it. My balance on uneven ground sharpened before any strength change registered. The proprioceptive resolution sharpened through 3 weeks of slow sit-to-stand practice before the quadriceps themselves adapted. Gravel paths, cobblestones, the uneven lip where pavement meets grass, surfaces that had required conscious attention became surfaces the feet navigated without looking down. The cerebellum had rebuilt a spatial map detailed enough to handle terrain it previously needed eyes for. Now, why the aging body benefits more from slowness than the young body? Because the cerebellar degradation that age produces is the exact degradation slow movement reverses. Cerebellar precision degrades with age through a mechanism that is specific, measurable, and directly addressable. The cerebellar cortex has a three-layer architecture: granule cells at the base, Purkinje cells in the middle, and molecular layer interneurons at the top. The Purkinje cells are the bottleneck. Each one integrates input from roughly 200,000 parallel fibers and produces the sole output of the cerebellar cortex, the signal that controls the timing, force, and coordination of every voluntary movement. When Purkinje cells die, the computation they perform does not transfer to neighboring cells. The output pathway narrows. The movements it controlled become less precise. Purkinje cell density, the large neurons forming the output layer of the cerebellar cortex, decreases approximately 2.5% per decade after 50, as Rosenbaum established in human motor control. Each lost Purkinje cell takes with it the computation it performed: the timing calibration for a specific movement range, the force profile for a specific load, the coordination pattern for a specific trajectory. The programs that were precise at 30 are approximate at 60. Timing drifts, force profiles blur, trajectory accuracy diminishes. At habitual speed, the degradation is hidden. Momentum compensates for the imprecise program, and the movement still appears normal to anyone watching, including the person performing it. The fall reveals the degradation. The correction that took 80 milliseconds at 30, using Purkinje cells at full density and synaptic connections at peak efficiency, takes 120 milliseconds at 60, takes 120 milliseconds at 60. The 40 millisecond difference, invisible in every clinical test, undetectable by any standard neurological assessment, unmeasurable without laboratory equipment that no routine checkup includes, is the fall. 40 milliseconds between recovery and fracture, between continued independence and the hospital bed. Tragedy of the timing is its invisibility. No clinical test at a routine checkup measures cerebellar computation speed. No blood test detects Purkinje cell loss. No scan at standard resolution shows the synaptic thinning that slows the correction by 40 milliseconds. The degradation accumulates silently across decades of habitual speed movement that never tested the system. The first test of the computation's integrity is the fall itself. Slow movement practice replaces that first test with a daily one, a controlled challenge that reveals the computation deficit without the consequences of the uncontrolled challenge that tests the computation without warning. Directly addressing the degradation by forcing the cerebellum to compute rather than retrieve, to generate real-time solutions rather than play stored ones. Slow movement exercises the exact neural pathways the fall will demand. Purkinje cells that are declining receive activation that maintains their function through use, dependent synaptic reinforcement. The same principle operating throughout the nervous system, where neurons that fire maintain their connections and neurons that coast lose them. Synaptic connections that are weakening receive the computational demand that prevents further decline. The computation speed the fall requires is practiced daily rather than tested only at the moment of crisis. The daily practice is the insurance policy. The crisis is the claim. And the cerebellum that practices computing every morning is the cerebellum that can pay when the claim arrives on the wet bathroom tile at 2 in the morning. For anyone with diagnosed vestibular disorders, active neurological conditions affecting balance, or recent joint replacement, discuss slow movement protocols with your physician before beginning. The cerebellar demands described are genuine and should be introduced gradually under appropriate guidance. Protocol requires no tradition, no technique, no equipment. Any movement you already perform becomes cerebellar training when performed at 1/3 of habitual speed. The threefold reduction eliminates momentum assistance, forces the cerebellum below its automation threshold, and sustains proprioceptive sampling long enough for high-resolution mapping. Self-assessment requires no equipment beyond a chair. Stand in front of a chair, set a timer for 10 seconds, and lower yourself to seated at a constant speed over the full duration. Note where the tremor begins. That position marks the boundary where the stored program fails and real-time computation begins. Note where you speed up involuntarily. The acceleration reveals positions where the cerebellar demand exceeded its current capacity and the system switched back to the stored program for relief. Note whether you hold your breath. The breath hold reveals the diaphragm motor dissociation. These three observations, tremor position, involuntary acceleration, and breath holding, map the cerebellar landscape more precisely than any clinical balance assessment available without laboratory equipment. Repeat weekly. The changes in all three markers track the cerebellar adaptation as it develops. Sit down in 3 seconds instead of 1. Stand up in 3. Walk at 1/3 pace for 2 minutes and notice what changes. At habitual pace, walking is the most automated movement in the human repertoire. The stored program runs so efficiently that you can walk while talking, thinking, navigating, and barely register the movement at all. At 1/3 pace, the automation breaks, each step requiring conscious placement, the heel-to-toe transition demanding attention. The single leg stance phase, the moment when your entire body weight balances on one leg while the other swings forward, becomes a balance computation the cerebellum must solve in real time rather than retrieve from storage. 2 minutes of slow walking forces. A real-time solution for every step. A computational demand habitual pace walking never imposes. Reach for a cup over 3 seconds. Turn to look behind you over 5 seconds instead of 2. Each repetition exercises Purkinje cells that would otherwise remain idle. Morning is optimal. The cerebellar system has been offline during sleep, the stored programs have not been refreshed by recent execution, and the first slow movement of the day encounters the system at its least calibrated. The tremor is most pronounced in the morning for exactly this reason, and the training effect is greatest where the tremor is greatest. A single slow sit to stand, 10 seconds down, 10 seconds up, performed once per day is 20 seconds of cerebellar computation that the fast version completes in 2 seconds of playback. The training effect is embedded in the daily movement you already perform. The adaptation is fast, faster than muscle, which requires 6 to 8 weeks. Cerebellar synaptic reinforcement operates on a shorter timeline. The tremor that is pronounced in the first week diminishes by the second as Purkinje cells rebuild the computation pathway through use. Dependent reinforcement. By the 3rd to 4th week, the movement that was shaky at 10 seconds becomes smooth at 10 seconds. The smoothness is the proof, and the signal to slow further, find the new tremor boundary, and train there. The only variable is speed. Paradox resolves. The aging body moving slowly is not failing. It is computing. 1/3 speed. Any movement. The 69 billion cerebellar neurons are waiting for the demand. The demand arrives the precise moment you choose 1/3 speed. Every single slow repetition is a computation. Every computation is training, and the training addresses the exact system the fall will test, the system that has been coasting for decades and needs the demand only slowness can provide.